All right, welcome everyone to the Rabbi and the Shrink. And today is our number 12. We have here an amazing guest speaker to speak on civility in the workplace. The good rabbi will introduce her properly.
Thank you, Doctor.
You're welcome.
Dubbing herself Chief Civility Officer. Our guest today is not your average employment law attorney. She is the rarest of breeds, a lawyer who wants to avoid litigation. Her more than 15 years of experience advising clients, human resource personnel, and legal counsel regarding sound standard employment practices uncovered a need and a personal passion for bringing more proactive, relevant, and impactful workplace training programs to her clients and their teams to explore the interplay between ethics and civility. Sajal Thakkar, thank you for joining us on the Rabbi and the Shrink.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, wonderful. Well, why don't you kick it off? What is the main reason why you think civility in the workplace is such a pivotal issue?
Yeah, as we just said in the introduction, I've been an attorney, and the cases that I really focused in on were harassment and discrimination cases. So I was defending managers in these cases. And as I was doing this work, it became very clear to me that a lot of times, companies were spending a lot of money on anti-harassment and trying to create better workplaces. But I just noticed that there was a gap in a lot of organizations. What I was seeing was that they weren't covering the civility angle, meaning like, what does civility mean for everybody? What do we do if we experience it? And what should I do if I see somebody else experiencing it? So these behaviors weren't getting addressed. The only time I was getting pulled in was when there was a lawsuit. And now we're dealing with harassment, discrimination. So I think it's very important. And so a lot of the work that I do is trying to work with companies before the lawsuit so we can prevent from getting there and hopefully prevent a toxic work environment from happening.
Well, that sounds great. Well, two things. One is, I don't know if you can speak a little louder or have your microphone closer.
Okay.
You have a lovely voice, but it's a bit soft for my old ears.
No problem.
And two, you talked about harassment and discrimination. What does civility have to do with either of those and with ethics?
Okay, so can you hear me better now?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Just making sure.
Thank you.
So civility, so tell me your question again, so I make sure I cover
So
it.
what does civility have to do with ethics? Let me just break it apart.
Yeah, civility and ethics go hand in hand, right? So when I talk about civility, I'm really talking about making sure every person within the organization understands what behavior is okay and what behavior is not okay. Obviously, we don't want ethical behavior to occur in the organization. So ethical behavior is something also that I think is very important, that organizations have clear policies, just like on civility, also with ethics within the organization. So people know, what do we mean by what's okay, what's not ethical, what is ethical. So same thing with civility. It's every organization needs to create these as core values and then define them for whatever that means for the organization. And then let their employees know that this is okay under our ethics policy, this is okay under our civility policy, and this isn't. And so that's, again, a great question, because I think there's a huge gap in that in a lot of companies.
So where in your experience, oh, I'm sorry, Rabbi.
I was going to say, would you say that ethics is more of an internal mindset and civility is the external behavior that emerges from that mindset?
I think you can look at it that way. I also think that it could be looked at a different way too, is that they're both, I mean, when we look at behavior, we're measuring it by external things, right? But I think that civility, a part of that is helping people understand what that means. So a part of being civil is also understanding that what it means to be respectful, right? So that's the mindset part of it, is teaching people that. So I think mindset is also a part of how I would define civility. There's a part that how we measure it, but also each person individually needs to commit to treating people with respect and dignity.
And what, in your experience, is the thing that happens in an organization that somehow invites behavior that's not civil and not ethical.
Yeah, I think it really boils down to defining it. What do we mean when we say civility or ethics, right? And then clearly communicating that to every employee. And that's where I think there needs to be work done, because lots of times you'll have those core values or you'll have policies around it, but then the employees don't understand what it means or what to do when it's something is happening and they find themselves unfortunately in those situations where they're dealing with unethical or uncivil behavior in the workplace. They just don't know what to do. And this is why, again, why I pivoted from being a defense attorney to the work that I'm doing now, is because these weren't bad people. It wasn't like these super, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's always a few bad apples in every bunch. And so there are plenty of those too. But I'm saying the majority of what I was seeing was people just not understanding what to do when they get themselves in these situations. And so more than litigating the case, I was explaining to people what they should and shouldn't do, right? So I was like, okay, if I'm going to be doing this anyway, I might as well stop doing this piece, which is too late, in my opinion. Organizations shouldn't be getting involved at that point. We should be creating an environment where that kind of stuff doesn't happen in the first place.
Yeah, it seems that the ethical outlook here is that rather than waiting for problems to happen, let's try to figure out how to prevent them from happening.
Exactly.
And it's pretty basic,
Mm-hmm.
but there's something about our brain function that we try to, we don't want to deal with things until they become problems. But of course, once they do, then they're much harder to deal with.
Exactly. And that's where the whole legal compliance thing comes in. Companies were checking these boxes to say, we've got the policy, we do our investigations, we provide the once a year training. And obviously that didn't work. That's why we're in the mess that we're in right now, is because that's all they were doing, rather than focusing on what I think what you're doing with your work. What I'm trying to get to is, let's get to the core, let's get to the root cause. Let's not just keep putting band-aids on things. That doesn't work. And there's plenty of statistics and research to support this, right? It's nothing new. And so you wonder, again, going back to what you're saying, it seems so basic. So why isn't it happening? Right.
Yeah.
One of the things I've been struggling with organizations is they have the policies, they have checked all those boxes. They even know maybe what is ethical and what isn't, what is civil and isn't, but they don't know how to respond. They don't know how to communicate it. And if there is an incident, they either go down like a hammer and then they shut all conversation up because they've been too harsh, or they say, oh, boys will be boys, or that's how women are, or whatever, and they excuse it and they don't address it. Yeah. So what can you say in terms of preparing all of our audience members? What can they do to increase a culture of civility in their workplaces?
Great question. I think there's a lot, right? I think the first thing is going to what you're talking about, is from where I saw it in the work that I was doing, is investigations, right? So when something gets reported, which by the way, this is a great statistic, is that 3 out of 4 people do not report harassment that's happening in the workplace. So all the numbers that we all quote as attorneys and what we're talking about is only what's reported. So the problem is a lot bigger than what's being reported, 3 times bigger.
And could you define harassment for everyone?
Yeah. So harassment and so there's discrimination and there's harassment. So they're 2 different, from a legal standpoint, you can bring 2 separate claims. You can bring one for discrimination, one for harassment. Harassment could be twofold, right? It could be, if we're talking about sexual harassment, it could be quid pro quo harassment, meaning you have a supervisor and an employee, and now the supervisor is using his position of authority, his or her position of authority, and making sexual demands, threats, asking for things from an employee, who then feels like, I need to go along with this, otherwise my job, or I'm going to face some sort of negative adverse action. So that's one kind. And then the other kind is what we call a hostile work environment harassment, where now an employee is having to deal with behavior that's happening. It's either severe behavior or it's all over. The employee can't escape it, right? It's pervasive behavior that's happening in the workplace. And a reasonable employee, so someone in we look at it both from an objective and a subjective standpoint, right? A reasonable employee wouldn't and shouldn't have to tolerate that kind of behavior. So depending on what kind of harassment you have, and then discrimination is different, right? So discrimination is where you're treating somebody differently than other employees because they belong to some kind of protected category. So protected category is something that's needed in both types of cases. Even in your harassment, you have to tie it to a protected category, at least in California. So each state has different laws on these issues. So you really have to check the law to see what constitutes a protected category and what doesn't. So California is we have, I think, over 17 different protected categories in our state.
Wow.
Our employees are really protected here. Yeah.
Does that have any adverse effect if employees feel, and I've heard that this is becoming a problem, that people feel like I can't say anything, I have to be so careful. We have this new term, microaggression, and I've kind of mixed feelings about it, because we used to just talk about people who were rude or people who were ill-mannered or people who were socially clumsy. Microaggression seems to elevate it to a sort of transgressional type of language. And if people are so skittish in the work environment, I feel like I better just keep my mouth shut, because there's too much danger, there's too much risk. How do we find a balance between being respectful, but also being willing to recognize that people are imperfect and sometimes get tripped up?
Yeah, it's a tough balance. It really is. It's hard. And especially when you put in people with all different kinds of personalities, different cultures, different communication styles, so many differences. And this is where I think it really has to be from the top down. Leadership plays a really important role in this equation. If they're out there, acting in these ways that everyone's looking at what they're doing, and now they're thinking this has become normal in that organization. So it really depends on how much you've let these behaviors continue and they've now become normal. Then you're going to have to do a lot more work to get to the middle ground. If you've done it from the beginning and your leaders have set that standard, and there's plenty of, organizations that do, right? And so I think it's important, especially for those companies that are starting out, to start the foundation, and do your best to really set that as the foundation of dignity and respect for all. If you do that, then you won't have to work as hard. Right. But if you've got leaders that are out there and they're making all kinds of, statements on social media, for example, we're seeing a lot of that right now. So that one's the first one that comes to my mind. But, if your leadership is, endorsing and really not walking the talk, right, then that's going to create an environment of it's not going to create an environment where there's psychological safety. The whole point, going to what you're talking about, is if you create a culture of psychological safety, then people can have conversations without blowing things up and ending up in court. They could just say, hey, look, you made that statement to me and maybe you were trying to be funny, but because of my culture, it rubs me the wrong way. So if we can create an environment where we can say that to each other, we don't have a problem. Right. But if people are afraid to say that to each other, you've got a problem. You've got some work to do.
Right. So Richard has something to say. The issues of harassment and discrimination are manifestations such as symptoms of a lack of ethical knowledge. Corporations need to make ethics a strategic imperative and to teach the discipline of ethics on an ongoing basis. Yeah. Hear, Richard.
Totally.
So as a psychologist, though, the one thing I know is if I ask a group of CEOs or owners, who here is ethical? They all raise their hand. Who here has an ethical workplace? They all raise their hand. And yet I know for sure that many of them are missing the point. They miss the point because they haven't created a culture where everyone can say, hey, I think we're missing the point here. But also there's something that my friend, Dr. Helen Turnbull, talks about, unconscious bias. Sometimes we're not aware. For instance, I'm Cuban. I look at Cubans and go, no wonder she's so pretty. No wonder he's so handsome, because they're Cuban. I mean, and Rabbi, I'm sure you say, oh, he must be brilliant. He is Jewish, And so I think there's an unconscious bias because we like and trust people that are kind of like us. It's easier. And I think sometimes we miss the boat that maybe we're not treating men and women the same, or people of different backgrounds, languages, religions, or whatever. what do you say to that unconscious bias? Because I think the policies and the starting the foundation right is strictly not enough.
100% agree with every single thing you just said. I mean, it is so true. And this is what was so frustrating for me is that as a lawyer, when I got involved and I was looking at these cases, I was like, if these people understood that they're just having a misunderstanding or a difference in opinion, and they knew how to communicate with each other and help each other understand that, it's just because of what I've gone through in my life. So all unconscious bias is we're all hardwired, right? So it's all about what we've been through in our life. So we see somebody for the first time, for example, and because of my past experiences and what attitudes I've been exposed to in my own life, I look at them as being different from me, right? So our brain automatically makes all these judgments about every single person that we meet, right? So the point is employees need to understand that this, and I could talk about this for days because I love this topic, but but employees don't, I think that word bias is huge, right? And so it's just become this negative thing. And so people don't want to do the work to really figure out their own, because we all have them. It's like, if you've got a brain, you've got bias, right? So it's just about figuring out what your own are, so that now when you're interacting with people, it doesn't turn into a microaggression. It doesn't turn into uncivil behavior, because you'll be able to recognize it. And so if everybody's empowered and everybody understands their own, that's the time, that's the way that you can really help people. And there's simple tools that can really help people and start doing their own inner work, right?
Yeah, one of the most insightful observations that I've come across is from Stephen L. Carter, who's written some wonderful books, one's titled Civility. And he points out early on that the word civility is the same root as civilization, which I think is a really compelling way to think about it.
Yeah.
Because civilization is not just about laws and rules. It's about respecting one another and feeling that we have a common bond as a larger community. And there's so many competing values in our societies. I read a study that said that sarcastic people are perceived as being more intelligent.
Then you're brilliant, right?
Well, the good doctor tells me that my sarcasm is endearing.
I like sarcasm.
I've found that sarcasm is something that I've been dealing with for 40 years, because I believe that it is something that's really corrosive, certainly if it's taken too far.
It can be.
Yeah. So if you have a society that values sarcasm, which is often uncivil or incivil, then we're back to this tug of war between the different cultural values. And I don't know if there's a solution, or if it's just a question of trying to manage that, being aware of the inevitable tension, accepting it, and trying to develop strategies and habits that help us do that successfully.
Well, Charlotte offers a solution. If people start recognizing bias, it is no longer unconscious if they're listening. So technically, she said, we need to be told by somebody that we rubbed them the wrong way. And the problem is, it takes courage and some skill to be able to say, hey, those kinds of jokes for me are offensive, or I'm worried that if you tell that joke that all rabbis with white shirts will have their feelings hurt or feel singled out or whatever. And so I think that learning how to do that. So when I do a workshop, I teach people how to do that. And we have table teams. Well, when we met in real life, and we'd ring the bell, and we would do insults left and right. And it's amazing how often, if I insulted men, no one would complain. They'd gotten used to a woman insulting a man. That's not right. It's fun for me. But it's interesting how you have to teach the emotional understanding that this is a problem. It's kind of like abused people, after a while, don't think of it as anything but their fault. They may not understand it's abuse. So that's interesting. So what do you say to that, ma'am?
I love that. Thank you, Charlotte. I mean, that's exactly it. Here's the only thing I'm going to add to what she wrote, and I love everything she was saying, is that that's my whole point, is that people don't know. And so we have to give them the tools, right, for them to figure that out. And then how do we put people on notice? Right. So if now somebody says something or they make a stereotype like the examples that you both just gave, and now it's offensive to me, what do I do in that situation? Right. I need to know what I should be doing in that situation, because the reality is, I think most people, not everybody, most people, when you tell somebody that you're making me uncomfortable, they're going to stop. We're not going to work to try to harass people or make people feel uncomfortable. We're going to work to do our work, right? And so we need a way to be able to tell somebody that their behavior, just strictly their behavior, is making you feel uncomfortable, and create an environment where that person feels safe to do that, because most people are going to stop. Now, for those that continue, then, because now it's conscious, to going to what Charlotte is saying, now that person is aware, whether they meant to or not, whether they intended to or not, doesn't matter. They are aware now. And now it is their responsibility, and they're accountable for monitoring their own behavior going forward. So if they continue behaving in that behavior, now the organization needs to get involved and put an end to it, so it doesn't continue up that progression. Because if you allow that behavior to continue, now we do a full circle. It's a doorway into a toxic work environment. And now we're back to where we don't want to be. So
what I recommend for organizations is, let's say you and I have a discussion that we both tell our supervisors, we had this discussion and this is the great resolution we came up with. I think it's important to report incidents that have been resolved and incidents not resolved. Report. You cannot expect top-down leadership if at any level we're not reporting on up to the top. Yeah. So I think it's critical that we recognize not only the problems, but the solutions that are cool and that can become part of the culture. Now, Jenny has a solution. She said they were told in their diversity training class at Washington U to say, ouch, if you don't know how to explain it any better. That's not so bad, is it? Ouch.
Yeah.
It's kind of like uncle. It's a universal thing, but now uncle is non-binary or binary. So maybe you can't say uncle. But ouch, I think it's lovely, Jenny. Thank you.
Yeah, I was hurt.
Yeah.
And I'm doing it in a way, I think it's really quite brilliant, actually.
I think so too.
I'm doing it in a way that it's not projecting any kind of blame.
Yeah.
It's 100% my personal experience.
Yeah.
And that makes it so much easier to address without becoming defensive. And I love what you were saying, Sajal, about there's a balance between individual responsibility. We talk about this all the time, that I have to be responsible for myself, but there's also a collective responsibility. And so the way I see it is that compliance is the collective responsibility, and it has to be tempered or filtered through the individual response, which is where personal ethics really come in.
And yet what I see, the epic fail in my dealing with clients where there's already a problem, is that one individual does not report because they think everyone else will. So I'm going to add to that with ethics. If I'm not offended, but I think someone else might be, or if I think something is potentially lawsuit worthy or harassment worthy or whatever, I need to speak up and say something to the person, but also up the chain. We may have an issue. I think it needs addressing. Ta-da! And not a big complaint. You don't even have to name names if you don't want to. Now, if someone is a repeat offender, one should name names, because then it could be noted for re-education or for firing people, after all the proper channels. We have a question from Aya, I think for you. How would you categorize or prioritize all these aspects you have already mentioned? What do you think?
As far as, I just need a little bit more clarification on that question.
I'm not sure what she meant. How would you prioritize? I'm not sure what she meant. Aya, do you want to type more in the chat so we understand more of it? In the meantime, Richard is saying it's not enough to say I was hurt. The question is what caused the hurt? Was it my false belief about how I should be treated? or was the other person treating me wrongly? Both people need to discuss it. It can't be assumed that the victim is mistreated. Here, very nice.
Totally.
A lot of times we do this victimization thing, and sometimes it's not about victimization, but maybe one person misunderstood, or maybe someone is very ultra sensitive in maybe even a pathological way. It's interesting.
And which actually comes into another aspect here that, when I'm on the receiving end, I have to make a decision about when to make an issue of something and when to simply let it pass. It just reminded me, I was in a meeting, a virtual meeting not so long ago, and we were doing some improvisational exercises. And so one of the classic ones is yes and. When somebody says something, you say yes, and then you add to it as opposed to going off in your own direction or saying something else. And the person who followed me in this exercise, I said what I had to say, and she responded yes, or, and said something completely different. And I found it a little bit, off-putting, because it was essentially, it was an implicit rejection of what I'd said. But one of the instructions we've been given was, if someone else doesn't follow the rules, just go with it. So, okay, I felt a little bit miffed, but I didn't make an issue of it. We went around the circle again. I said my piece. It came to her. She said, yes, or, and did it again. I let it go again. When we came back together, the facilitator who was processing, and I don't think he was in our room, or I didn't see him there. He said, now you see the power of yes and by the way, yes or is not the same as yes and. So I kept quiet. I didn't make an issue of it, but the authority in that situation anticipated that could be an issue. And that was very comforting to me. I didn't have to stand up for myself because someone else intervened and did so for me.
And I love that.
They waited 2 times.
Yeah, I love that. I really,
Yeah.
and I think what you're talking about there is just such an important point, is that really it is the bystanders' responsibility to intervene in those situations. And especially if there's authority in the room, as there's leadership in the room, they should be the first ones on that, because the person that's dealing with it, you're battling your own emotions, your own feelings in the moment. And especially somebody, whether that was something intended to harm you or not is really not the issue. It's how you were perceiving it and how it was making you feel. If somebody is dealing with that kind of situation all the time, where they're feeling that, we really can't put the burden on them to then also be the one to speak up and educate. We encourage people to do that. I certainly in my trainings encourage people to, in the right way, speak up or address the situation. But really, it's everybody else that's observing this behavior and maybe able to see that this could be taken a different way. We really need them to be standing up and speaking up and addressing it in the right way. Really, the burden is on them, the bystanders.
Yeah,
Has anyone been sued in a harassment suit for being a bystander that said nothing?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question.
Has anyone been sued in your experience for being a bystander that said nothing?
Well, yeah, this happens all the time. When supervisors, like they are agents of an organization and they observe behavior or they allow behavior to continue.
Well, not in the chain of command. Can just anyone at the same level below be sued for being a silent bystander?
No, they can't, unless they somehow participated in there. So it would have to be a chain of command for it to be a legal thing. Now, that being said, if you allow it to continue, and it's going to impact the culture of your organization. So this would be one of those things that I would say, let's not just focus on legal compliance and worry about whether it's going to be something that we could be sued over. Let's make sure everybody in the organization understands we're empowering each and every single one of you to speak up when these things happen, right? We don't want to be telling employees that you can't be sued, because then they're going to allow that stuff to happen. We want to say, if you see it, you got to speak up, because you're empowered and you're a leader and we need you to be a part of the culture, right? So I just want to make that very clear. Yeah.
I love that. So we have Aya who has clarified. Discrimination, harassment, civility. How would you categorize or prioritize all these in an organization? And she goes on to say, what's more important to be focused on or emphasized in your opinion or experience?
Yeah, I think this is what you do is you focus in on civility, because civility includes all of those other things, all of the behaviors that lead to discrimination, that lead to harassment, that lead to microaggressions. So let me just define, like when I talk about civility, it makes sense to understand what do we mean by incivility, right? So I include in incivility everything from microaggressions to rude, unprofessional behavior, all the way up to your abusive conduct, bullying behavior. And it also includes your harassment and discrimination that are illegal behaviors, right? So it's a whole spectrum of behaviors. So if you focus in on civility, you're going to include all of that stuff into it.
That's brilliant. Good for you. Do they understand, do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, that's part of what the focus needs to be in these trainings, is helping employees understand, wait a second, we're not going to just worry about just the ones, it always pissed me off as an attorney when I look at clients and they're like, we provide our managers with sexual harassment training once a year. And I'm like, what about everybody else? What about discrimination? What about when somebody has a microaggression? What about all these other areas? So that's why I call myself the chief civility officer, because I want to talk about all of those behaviors, and let's equip and empower your team to know what to do when they're dealing with any of those behaviors, because those are not okay, whether or not they're legally actionable or not. Right. So that's why when you said it earlier, I was like, wait, let's clarify. I don't want to focus in on what's legally actionable. That's what got us in this mess in the first place.
I think you're right. So I'm going to say what Richard said, and then Rabbi, I'd like a story from you. I miss your stories. So here's first from Richard. All people must be educated to know that their unconscious bias always operating, indeed, so that when something goes wrong, all involved can say, maybe it is my unconscious bias that is causing the problem. And then let's take a look at it, not just say, well, it's not conscious, so it's not my fault. Then it's up to them to make it conscious. Rabbi, you got a story for us? I miss your stories.
Well, let that percolate for a moment. There's something that I've wondered about for a long time, and I guess I still will. But I'm an introvert, and my wife is an extrovert, and I think that's not that uncommon that we have those kinds of mixed marriages. But isn't civility going to be defined differently or understood differently by people of different personality types?
Yes.
What's considered invasive for an introvert might be just normal discourse for an extrovert, and what's what an extrovert would consider sort of aloof and disengaged would be particularly normal for an introvert. And how do we manage those different perceptions in our relationships?
Yeah, I mean, and that's again going back to defining what we mean by civility, right? So each organization needs to define what it means for them. So one of the definitions I like a lot of civility is one that a woman by the name of Dr. Cynthia Clark. She's a leading expert in this area on civility. She's been doing a lot of research in this area, and that's kind of her definition is what I use in my trainings, because I just love the way she defines it. But she talks about it from the perspective of civility is where you have an authentic respect for others. So then you have to help people understand what that means, right? But it also includes where you're going to empower people to understand that if we want civility to be part of our culture, what I like to say, a core part of your culture, then they have to make the time, they have to be present, and they have to have a willingness to engage in these conversations to be able to have genuine discourse when they do have these differences in opinion or differences in perspective or whatever that difference is, but that they're going to make the time, be present, and be willing to engage in genuine discourse, and then with an intention to seek common ground. So there's a lot that's within what I just said. And then you have to help your employees understand what each of those elements mean. What do we mean by respect? What do we mean by time, presence, willingness to engage? And what do we mean by common ground? So there's a lot that goes into helping employees understand what their own role is, as well as what everybody else's roles are. Right. So if you can get to that place, then that answers your question, right? So that people need to understand, it needs to be clearly communicated. And then when somebody files a complaint, or says, I'm still being treated this way, then the organization needs to respond appropriately, right? And so you don't just brush underneath the table or underneath the carpet. You need to investigate it. You need to then take action if it's warranted. So there's a lot that goes into what happens once that complaint is filed.
You're asking about stories. Sort of
Yeah.
it's a composite of a few different stories. And one of my favorite quotes these days is by Dolly Parton. Speaking of wisdom, right?
I
She
love
says,
her.
if you see someone that without a smile, give them one of yours. And in physics, we talk about a flame. A flame is the only thing you can give away without giving it away. And I can light your candle with my candle. I haven't lost anything in the process. A smile is the same thing. And we know that when you smile at somebody, they almost always smile back, which then makes me feel better. So I've been in a few situations at times where people commented on my smile. And it always kind of, I find it curious because I in none of those situations was I conscious of smiling particularly. And what I realized after this happened a few times is that they were all in situations where I really wanted to be where I was. I was talking to somebody in the hallway at the National Speakers Association annual conference, and somebody I'd met at breakfast walked by and said, "Brightest smile in the conference." I wasn't thrilled about anything. I really liked being there with colleagues. And it was all in, that was the common denominator. When we're in a situation where we want to be, we project a joy. And that infects other people, and that makes other people enjoy their experience. Well, maybe if we make ourselves a little more conscious of our behavior, we add to the community, we add to the environment, and that makes the environment better for everybody, and that makes the environment better for us. So we create a virtuous circle instead of a vicious circle by contributing positively.
I like that. Thank you. Jenny says, Rabbi Goldson, I'm going to watch to see if you're smiling in shul. The challenge has been brought.
I have to get back to synagogue. I'm getting my second shot soon, so we can start getting back to a little more normal life.
Well, I have a story from my mother. Many years ago, my mother was mugged right in front of our house when she was going from the car to the steps. And she got all banged up, and the guy stole her purse, and the police came, and my mother offered café cubano. That's before police were told you can't accept anything, right? And croquetas, and she was, being the hostess. And the young police officer said, "Ma'am, you were just knocked down and you're all bloody and robbed. And why are you being so polite?" And she raised herself up and she said, "You stole my property, not my dignity or my manners." Croqueta. And I always remember that we say who and when. No one can keep us from being civil. Would you, so you agree with that? Good.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Look at those stories. Wow, what a treat. So glad I came on. I got to hear these wonderful stories from both of you. Thank you.
Yeah, I love the rabbi stories. It's so much fun talking with them. We are glad you came on. I mean, you're certainly not your typical lawyer. And I imagine your workshops are a big hit. So how can they find out about your workshops so they can ask you to provide your services?
Yeah. So, if you're on LinkedIn, you can follow me on LinkedIn. I'm huge on sharing resources. I think there's a lot of garbage out there. So I try my best to put out solid resources that help people on the topics that we talked about. And then you can always go to my website. That LinkedIn is the only social media that I'm on. And then my website is www.trainextra, and there's no E in the extra.com.
EXTR?
So TRAINXTRA.com.
XTRA. Look in the chat, see if I got that right.
Yep. Nope. Just take out the E.
Oh, I thought you said the A, and I thought that didn't sound right. Extra.com. Okay, there you go.
That's it.
I had a problem with spelling it correctly. All right. So where does this leave us? Why is civility? There's two questions. Can we have good business if we do not have civility? Can we have democracy without civility?
Yeah, I think the answer is that you can't. Civility has to be the central theme. I see a lot of organizations right now focusing in on diversity and inclusion as being where a lot of efforts being put in, and I think it's very important. But I'm out there, and my perspective is that civility really needs to be a focus along with diversity and inclusion. I think a lot of the stuff what I'm seeing is people kind of lump it together, and they're very different, and what needs to be covered. But yeah, I think civility is the only way to survive. I mean, people's tolerance, especially this last year, after everything that's happened for incivility, is you could see it. Just go on any social media website. People are out there talking about it, and they're not messing around, even the smallest things. So everybody's eyes are on what organizations are doing and what they're tolerating. And so if you're tolerating incivility, that's going to hit social media. Your employees are going to be talking about it, and the damage is going to be even greater. So just start addressing, like we said, the root causes: ethics and civility, diversity and inclusion. I mean, it's not like you put everything in one basket. You really need to look at all of those components and figure out a good plan that works for your companies. And it's possible. I wouldn't be doing this work, I'm maybe going to say this for both of you as well. You wouldn't be doing your work if we didn't think it was possible. It's totally possible. But you just need to look at it from a holistic standpoint and come up with the right solution for your company, right?
That puts me of mind.
Also suggests that if we are civil and people feel comfortable speaking up, it enhances two things that anyone in business likes: creativity and productivity. And diversity too. So if you have a bunch of people with different kinds of minds, different backgrounds, different ways of looking at things, working together in a comfortable environment, it makes things more creative. And with creativity comes innovation and efficiency. So it is amazing how, if you tell people it's profitable to have these cultural elements flamed every day. I'm going back to your physics, Rabbi. We fan the flames of civility. I think it makes a huge difference.
And that's why we say that good ethics really is good business, and civility is part of that. But you put me in mind of something that's very much in the headlines these days, what's being called cancel culture. And I think that cancel culture comes from a good place. It is the idea of let's shut down those voices that are corrosive, that are uncivil, that are caustic. But it's also very controversial, because once you start applying value judgments to people's speech, now it's not necessarily the style, it's the opinion itself. So the original intent to enforce civility ends up producing an uncivil response. And now we're back into that tension and that conflict between wanting to make things better and sometimes making them worse through our efforts.
Yeah. So Charlotte says, perhaps it's more possibility in organizations where the founders are not brilliant jerks. It's hard to stand up for civility. You have ever been taken to task for being uncivil yourself? I think I can think that every one of us has been taken to task for being uncivil. Even if you have to think back when you were 5 and you told a boy that he was stinky. I mean, it doesn't take much to go back into your own life, and maybe even just a thought. Today I went to get my COVID vaccine, and someone got out of their car and he didn't have his mask on. He went around to the side to get his wife, who was on crutches, without the mask. And then he put his mask. But in the time he got out, I saw 3 dirty looks aimed at his direction. Yeah. And it is interesting, if we don't think shaming is alive and well in America, all you have to do is see someone without a mask, and wow, we're still very good at it in this country. It is amazing.
Yeah, that's a shame. Yeah.
We also have an anonymous attendee what is the relationship between civility and ethics? We covered it, but I think it's a good time to revisit that. It's a really good question. So I'll ask to both of you, and we'll see how civil you handle if you both start talking at the same time. Ready, set, go.
I'm going to let our guest go ahead, and then I'll.
What a gentleman. All right.
Yeah, I think they go hand in hand. That's my definition of it. They're different and they're defined differently. Their goals are different, but they go hand in hand, and both are critical components of what needs to be taken into consideration as part of every organization. And frankly, just as every person, you want to act according to your own, what the ethics are, not just externally, but also intrinsically, what is important to you, and how are you going to act towards people that may be different than you, right? So the whole civility piece, I think it's all wrapped up into understanding what is okay with you, both ethically and civility. So I don't think you can say they're part of each other. I think they're two separate, distinct things. That being said, they're very interrelated as well.
Well, and yet in some professional codes like speakers, the National Speakers Association, civility is part of professionalism. It is part of professional relationships. And so it is very much the same. So for speakers, so I think more sophisticated organizations who understand the implications are adding, just like the National Speakers Association, that civility is indeed one of the ethical tenets. And it's put in the two places, that you have to be good to fellow speakers and you have to be professional. So I'm delighted. So I challenge everyone out there with your organization, if you have one, add it. And if it's not there, talk to the person in charge of updating the ethics policy. And you know what? One voice spoken thoughtfully in the right way at the right time without criticism can change the world. So my suggestion is, be thoughtful. If you need help figuring out how to say that, the rabbi and I are never short an opinion. We'll be glad to tell you 5 different ways to do it and agree or disagree nicely on all of them.
And I think I like that idea that civility is one manifestation of ethics.
Yes.
I think also there's an opportunity here to tie in the word of the day.
Oh, good. What is it?
Word of the day is verbicide. We know what homicide is. That's killing a person. Verbicide is killing a word or killing language through misuse or misapplication. Now, I've wondered for a long time that civility is such a fundamental principle. We already said it's part of civilization. So it made me wonder why over the years we've developed this new term called political correctness. If civility was a good idea, why was it necessary to change it to come up with a new term? And my conclusion was that civility is my own awareness of how I should act towards you. Political correctness is you telling me how I'm allowed to act towards you. So political correctness becomes weaponized civility. And I think that's the verbicide here, is that we have taken the concept of civility and we've turned it into a justification for being incivil or uncivil, because we want to police others before we take responsibility for ourselves. And that's really what civility is as an expression or manifestation of ethics, is me being aware, taking responsibility, and implementing the steps necessary to make sure as best I can that I'm not causing unnecessary pain to others.
And Aya has a response that goes along with it. Do you believe that civility has to be more focused in organizations or society? And what is the role of culture in civility? I'll let you handle that, ma'am.
Yeah, so just adding on to what was just said is that, again, if we're defining civility as each one of us being aware of what our role is and what our behavior is acceptable or not. So it's really on each person within a culture, because the culture is made up of the people that are within that organization. So if we do it, and I agree with everything that was just said by the rabbi, that if we empower each and every person within the culture to understand what civility is and how to behave and what is expected from them if somebody else doesn't as a bystander, then that's going to change the culture itself, right? And again, going back to what we just said is, if you allow people and you teach them how to do this, because we can't assume people know. And that's what I think it is I think we expect people to know what we mean by civility. I think you have to train them and educate them. But once they do, then again, the focus of the culture is psychological safety, so that we can have these conversations with each other when somebody is maybe trying their best or maybe trying to be civil according to their own values, but it isn't matching up with what you're expecting or what it means to you, to be able to have that discourse, to be able to resolve that situation in the right way, in a professional, respectful way. Right. So it's going to definitely impact your culture. The more you show people how to be civil and that becomes part of your culture, it's going to change your culture as well, and then create that psychological safety. So again, they go hand in hand. You need to have both of them to be part of, to create a better culture.
I agree. And the rabbi was talking about that balance.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the remedy if you have somebody high up in organization or low down, doesn't matter, that is narcissistic to the point of not being well? And so they take offense at things that were not meant to be offensive. They cause trouble when there was no intent. I mean, how far does someone have to go to anticipate and respond to someone who is that unwell?
Yeah, and if that happens, I've had cases like that where I've had to deal with those complaints and investigate them. And so absolutely happens in organizations. And that's again where organizations have to be very clear on their policies, right? So the way you said it was that this is repeated behavior, right?
Yes.
So if there's evidence, now somebody files a complaint, I get pulled in to do investigations. I mean, I don't do that as much anymore. I'm focused really on training right now, but part of what the work that I've done in my career is doing these workplace investigations. So if I got pulled in to do an investigation and there's evidence to support that this person is now being malicious or falsely filing these complaints of uncivility or harassment or discrimination, then me as an investigator needs to include that in my report. And then the company needs to then respond to that. You know, one of the things that I always tell companies is, don't take these investigations as a kind of this one-off, let's check the box situation. Oftentimes their evidence, and they will turn up things to show that this is a pattern. There's more going on of this in the organization. So then if that's the case in the scenario you presented, that this would be something now that the organization needs to respond to. Right. So whether that is getting rid of that person, whether that's disciplining them, it's going to depend on the facts. You know, there's no one bright line rule as to what we do as an organization. Each case is different, but they need to do something about it. They can't just continue to allow that to happen. This is disrupting not only that one person, it's going to disrupt the entire team. And then that's going to impact the bottom line. Right. So,
and maliciousness or not, some people are unwell and will consistently take offense with everyone, what anyone says. Maybe they're not being malicious, they're unwell. Some people are malicious and ching, looking to have money. I mean, I was even a part of one organization where one person was accusing another of a variety of things. It turns out they were in cahoots. They were going to split the money, because many organizations say we're going to settle out of court, and they were going to get however many thousands of dollars and split it. So it's interesting. Some of it is not malicious, but people being unwell. How do you proceed if someone is, pobrecito, unwell? They perceive a slight when most reasonable people would not perceive that. Yeah. What happens then?
My answer would still be the same.
Okay.
It would still be the same. That still doesn't, just because the person is unwell doesn't mean they can continue to harm the organization, right? So
yes, good.
There may be a situation now, again, it all depends on the facts. I'm just kind of throwing this out there, but it may be a situation, again, I'm just throwing out an option. I'm not recommending it, but it could be an option. It may be a situation that where this person might require some kind of reasonable accommodation, right? There might be an issue where the organization may be able to accommodate the person, or maybe, like, for example, here's the situation. Let's say you have two employees working together, right? And now this person is coming or feeling that this person is making harassing comments. Maybe one accommodation, again, if the facts warrant it, would be to separate the two of them so they don't need to work together as a reasonable accommodation. But my answer would still be the same. Now, if this continues to happen over and over again, now they move the person over here and now they're starting to take somebody else and they're taking a harassment and they're feeling they're being extra sensitive because of their unwellness, however, if that rises to a level of being a disability or not. But I would say if they continue doing it, it's time to get rid of that person, right? Because they're going to continue to harm the person. So my answer would still be the same. I mean, just because you have something that's preventing you from thinking properly.
Because this is the number one problem. People think someone's unwell, so I'm not going to document it.
Yeah, you can't.
So please listen to this brilliant lawyer. Regardless of the reason, document when things go well and when they don't go well. Either way, the documentation speaks to a pattern. Some people are certainly not a good match for certain jobs or roles in certain companies. And our job ultimately is to make sure that we're hiring the right people. And people are ultimately happier when they're in a place where they can shine, not when they enter into conflict readily.
I actually thought, Doctor, that I thought that you were asking a different question at the beginning, that what if you have somebody who is so sensitive that they are filing complaints about the most benign.
Well, that is what we're asking. Yes.
As opposed to the person who's implementing. We had a local radio show here in St. Louis, and the host was was a veteran radio personality. He was 80 years old. He was still hosting this show. And a former colleague of his came on as a guest, 75-year-old woman. And they had worked together for a long time. They hadn't seen each other for years. And this is the first time they'd seen each other in quite a long time. And he said, you look terrific. After the show, his manager called him in and reprimanded him for saying, "You look terrific." Which he responded to by saying, "Your privilege," and resigned. And it was a minor scandal here in town that most people agreed that this manager was, being way too sensitive.
Was the guest offended?
No.
Now, I know that for there to be a problem, the person that it was directed at doesn't have to be offended. This I know. It doesn't really impact policy or law. I get that. But it's interesting why the host was fired and not the manager.
No, the host wasn't fired. The host resigned.
Oh, okay. Host resigned.
I mean, I assume that
he was allowed to resign.
I don't know what it feels like to be 80 and still working, but I imagine that it's a little easier at that point in life.
I'll let you know. I look forward to that.
Yeah, but there has to be, and this applies to everything. There has to be a certain amount of common sense. And the thing about common sense is it's anything but common.
Isn't that truth? That's the truth. So we have a comment from Charlotte. I think that in the space between civility and the world of political correctness, as used by the rabbi, lies the normalcy of authentic apology when we have been civil by our own standards, but nevertheless have been insensitive and hurt somebody else, not on purpose. If we never apologize or even ridicule the other person, it gives life to PC. So I think this speaks to something that you had said before, that as a lawyer, that, when I first started my practice, I was told if anyone had any problem, don't apologize because it made me look guilty. Nowadays, we know apologize. So please speak to the legality and the wisdom of apologies.
No, I think it goes back to the issue of when a microaggression happens, right? So again, that's the base of this, is that one person is saying something that maybe they didn't intend to or want to harm the other person, but now it's being perceived as being harmful. We've allowed microaggressions or these situations to go on where it's now become a situation where it's a big deal. If people understood that microaggressions are not something that people pick up on unless they're being directed at them. Right. So if somebody does a microaggression to me, you might look at it and say, that's not harming her, but it's harming me because of a particular characteristic that I have. Right. So if I point it out to somebody, it's not about judging them or shaming them or making me feel bad. But if I do it in the right way, it's just letting that person know that, hey, that behavior that you just did is something that makes me feel uncomfortable. And here's why. Then that person's going to change. If that continues, that's where the apology comes in later on down the road. And I'm trying to say, let's try to address these situations so we don't even get there. But going to what Charlotte was saying, that's exactly it. Is that if somebody does point it out to you when it's a microaggression, there's nothing wrong with apologizing. Look, I do this work every day and I goof up and I say things that I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I just did that, right? Because again, we may have these habits that we've developed. They're not always good habits, right? We have bad habits too, that it's going to take a while to be aware of it. So for example, the other day I was training, right? And I was in the middle of my training. I said to somebody, you guys, I know I shouldn't be saying that because there were females in the audience, right? And I know that I have this problem. So I always catch myself and I'm working on it, but it slips out because it's been a part of my vocabulary for years. I'm not justifying it. It's wrong. I shouldn't have said it. But if I say it and if I catch it right away, I apologize. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. I meant, you folks or whatever. I catch myself and I recorrect it. Then it's an apology and nobody's going to be offended by it. Now, if somebody does come to me later on and say, hey, I was really offended by it, my only recourse at that point is to genuinely apologize and say, I understand. And I'm going to not do that again. And then try harder to not do that again. That's how we grow.
Right.
So create that space and then not judge, say, oh, not then be like, canceling me. Oh, I'm never going to hire Sajal again.
Right. Well, and we can thank people. Thank you for letting me know.
Yeah.
I will work on that.
Right.
All right. So now I have a conscious bias of being on time and our time is done. How about, is there one last thing you can leave people if they're in a situation that is struggling with civility in the workplace? What's the one thing or two things you recommend people do?
Yeah, I think, look, I think it's about letting people know in a respectful, professional way, without judgment, without shame, because it might be unintentional. It might be coming from a place of unconscious bias or just not understanding a culture. It could be ignorance. It could be a lot of different reasons why. So let's not judge that person. Let's let them know in a, again, respectful way, focused, very, very focused in on the behavior itself. When you interrupted me at that meeting, it made me feel like my voice wasn't heard, right? In the right way. Again, just focusing in on that behavior. Now, most people are going to stop because now you put them on notice. If the behavior continues, what I always recommend is, you've tried one time. If it continues, then follow your company's complaint process and report it. You have to report it. So document it, like you said, and report it, right? Because now it's continuing behavior. Again, it's just something that needs to be alerted to the organization so that they can do something to protect everybody, right? So it's not about, I want to get the person fired or disciplined. It's about, wait, we are all a part of this team. And if something's happening to me, it might be happening to other people. So I need to report it, right? So put the person on notice, document and report.
All right, that was good. Rabbi, one last word of wisdom?
Oh, well, there's a note in the chat that suggests that we don't have the right not to be offended, which is a kind of interesting way of looking at it. And I think it just goes back to this point we're making about trying to be balanced. If I take responsibility to try to avoid offending you, and you take responsibility to not look for reasons to be offended, then chances are we're going to get along okay.
Yeah.
And a sincere apology and a sincere question to try and understand is the best we can do to get things started. Just try and understand. A lot of people have a big reaction when someone else is upset by them. Listening and understanding, it's a good way of being civil. Well, I think that's all we have to say. Thank you so much for joining us. You've been a wonderful guest speaker. I'm delighted that you were with us. And we will see you all next week, where we have Shep Hyken, who's an amazing guy with a brilliant mind. He's a customer service expert, and he has many other points of expertise. We'll get a chance to hear from him next week. See you all then. Thank you for joining us.